The dog never barks at nothing. In 3 years on that ranch, Ranger had barked at exactly two things: a grizzly that wandered too close in October, and the night Daniel's brother called to say their father had died. So when the German Shepherd exploded off the porch at midnight, not growling, screaming, Daniel Cross was already reaching for the rifle before his boots hit the floor. He found her face down in the snow. Young, bleeding, designer coat soaked black with blood. And before she lost consciousness, she grabbed his wrist with what little strength she had left and whispered 4 words that changed everything. She wants me dead. If you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Like this video so more people find it, because trust me, you do not want to miss what happens next. The ranch sat 11 miles from the nearest paved road, and Daniel Cross had chosen it specifically for that reason. 11 miles of gravel, switchbacks, and unmarked turnoffs that confused delivery drivers and kept everyone else away entirely. The property itself was unremarkable from the air. A main cabin, a barn that leaned slightly east, 300 acres of high-elevation grazing land that hadn't seen cattle in 2 years, and a tree line so dense along the northern fence that sunlight never quite reached the ground beneath it. In winter, the whole place disappeared under snow and silence, and Daniel had come to depend on that silence the way other men depended on coffee or company. I was 40 years old. He had spent 22 of those years in uniform, the last 12 of them in naval special warfare. The kind of work that never appeared on official rosters and carried no medals you could display at a dinner party. He had run operations in places that didn't officially involve American personnel, made decisions that kept him awake past 3 a.m., and watched men he loved die in circumstances that would never be declassified. When he finally separated from service, he did it quietly, declined the debrief counseling, sold his apartment in Virginia Beach, and drove west until the cities disappeared. He told his brother he needed some time. That had been 3 years ago. He didn't own a television. His internet connection was a satellite dish that worked poorly in bad weather and that he used mostly to check weather forecasts and occasionally order gun parts. He spoke to his brother Marcus about once a month, kept those calls short, and spent the rest of his time fixing fences, cutting wood, reading military history, and running Ranger through the property in patterns that still looked suspiciously like patrol routes. Old habits. Ranger was a 5-year-old German Shepherd that Daniel had adopted from a military working dog retirement program 18 months ago. The dog had 3 combat deployments in Afghanistan, a titanium pin in his left rear leg from an IED blast, and the kind of calm, measured alertness that most police dogs spent years trying to develop. He was not a dramatic animal. He didn't bark at squirrels or chase deer or make noise for the sake of it. When something was wrong, he went still first, ears up, body rigid, nose working the wind, and only escalated if stillness wasn't enough. So when Ranger woke Daniel at 12:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in January with the kind of barking that Daniel hadn't heard since Kandahar province, the response was immediate and entirely unconscious. He was on his feet before he was fully awake, rifle in hand, boots half-laced, moving toward the door with the light off because light makes you a target, and some things you don't unlearn. The temperature outside was 9 degrees. The moon was 3/4 full, and the snow was fresh, maybe 4 inches that had fallen earlier in the evening, which meant the ground was reading like a tracking sheet. Daniel could see his own breath in Ranger's 2 small clouds moving fast toward the northern fence line. He swept the tree line with his flashlight. Nothing moved. Ranger had both front paws on the lowest fence rail and was barking at something on the ground, just on the other side. Not an animal. The body was too large, too still, the wrong shape entirely. Daniel vaulted the fence. She was lying face down, half in the snow, and half on a patch of frozen grass just inside the tree line. He read her the way he'd been trained to read downed personnel in the field, checking airway, breathing, pulse, and found all 3, barely. Pulse thready and fast, the kind that meant blood pressure dropping. She was dressed for somewhere else entirely, tailored wool coat, dark dress pants, low-heeled leather boots that were soaked through and falling apart at the seams. No gloves. No hat. The coat had been white once. Now it was dark along the left side from what looked like a wound somewhere under the fabric. "Hey!" He pressed 2 fingers to her neck again. "Can you hear me?" A sound. Something between a groan and an exhale. "I'm going to move you. Don't fight me." He got her across his shoulders in a modified fireman's carry, one hand already pressing against the left side of her rib cage where the coat was warmest and wettest. Ranger fell in at his left heel without being told, ears still moving, scanning behind them as Daniel moved back toward the cabin. He got the coat off her on the kitchen table. The wound was a through and through, high on the left side below the armpit. A clean entry hole about the diameter of a pencil, an exit wound on her back that was ragged and still seeping. Not arterial, or she would have been dead in the snow before he found her. But it had bled long enough, and she'd been in 9-degree weather long enough that her core temperature was somewhere in the danger zone. He worked without thinking, the way he'd patched men in the field. Irrigation, packing the exit wound, closing the entry, improvising a pressure wrap from the first aid supplies he kept stocked out of habit. He had a trauma kit under the sink that his brother's wife had once called insane for a civilian household. It had a tourniquet applicator, hemostatic gauze, a chest seal, a decompression needle, and a suture kit. He'd restocked it twice in 3 years and hoped each time that it would go to waste. He used the suture kit now. She came around somewhere in the middle of it, which was not ideal. Don't. He put one hand flat on her collarbone, not hard, just a clear signal. You're going to pull the line. Her eyes opened, dark brown, pupils equal and reactive. He checked because he needed to know if she'd hit her head. She hadn't, or at least not hard enough to matter. What he saw instead was something he recognized from his own mirror on bad nights. The specific look of someone who had been running on pure adrenaline for so long that the crash, when it came, felt like dying. Where am I? Her voice was barely there. Wyoming. Private property, north of Sheridan. You came through my fence line. He tied off the last suture and reached for the pressure bandage. You're safe for right now. Who shot you? Silence. I'm not law enforcement, he said. Not connected to anyone who is. My name is Daniel Cross. I'm a retired Navy SEAL who lives alone and doesn't make phone calls he doesn't have to make. If you've got someone after you, I need to know that because it affects whether I'm keeping the lights on or sitting in the dark. She stared at the ceiling for a long moment. My name is Celeste Vaughn. He didn't recognize it. Okay. My father is... What was... Warren Vaughn. She paused. Vaughn Industrial. He did recognize that. Warren Vaughn was the kind of name that showed up in business coverage, even if you didn't follow business coverage, the founder of one of the largest privately held industrial conglomerates in the American West, the kind of operation that touched mining rights, transportation infrastructure, and defense contracting in ways that made it relevant to people who didn't know it existed. He'd seen the name in briefing documents years ago, in a context he wasn't going to think about right now. He died, she said, 8 weeks ago. The official cause was cardiac failure. She turned her head and looked directly at him. He was poisoned. By who? Helena, his wife, my stepmother. The word came out like something she'd been chewing on for months and finally spat. She spent 2 years doing it, slowly, adjusting his medications, replacing one thing with another. By the time anyone thought to look, his heart was already failing and every doctor she'd selected had already signed off on a natural cause narrative. Daniel finished the bandage and stepped back. You have proof of this. I have documentation, financial records showing payments to the prescribing physician, communications between Helena and a private consultant with a chemistry background, and a recording. My father made it himself 4 weeks before he died. He knew something was wrong but didn't know what. He names her. She closed her eyes. I was getting ready to take it to federal prosecutors. 3 days ago, a car I didn't recognize forced my vehicle off Route 14 and into Granite Creek. I got out. They didn't expect that. How long have you been moving? 8 days. He looked at her. 8 days in January in Wyoming, shot, on foot through the mountains, in a coat designed for boardrooms. He tried to do the math and couldn't quite make it work. You crossed the Bighorns? The Southern Pass. I had a compass, and I kept moving at night. She almost said something else, then didn't. He pulled a chair close to the table and sat down. Who are the people chasing you? Contractors. Private. Helena's husband. She remarried within 6 weeks of my father's death. A state official named Raymond Galt has connections in the private security sector. The men who hit my car weren't law enforcement. They moved like military. How many have you seen? 4 at the car. 2 more at a gas station outside Buffalo where I tried to use a payphone 3 days ago. She paused. I didn't use the phone. Smart. Anyone know you came this direction? No one knows I'm alive. Her voice was flat when she said it. Not emotional, just a statement of the situation, which means no one's looking for me. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Ranger had settled by the front door, but his ears were still moving, not relaxed, monitoring. You need fluids and you need sleep, Daniel said. In that order. We can talk tactics in the morning. Tactics, she repeated, and something crossed her face that wasn't quite a smile. You came to the right fence. He made her drink 2 liters of water with electrolytes and got a wool blanket over her on the couch, then built the fire up and cut the exterior lights. He did a quick perimeter check, walking the fence line in the dark with Ranger, no flashlight, relying on the moonlight and the dog's nose. Nothing. Fresh snow showed no tracks besides his own and the earlier set he'd made carrying her. But that didn't mean nothing was coming. He came back inside, made coffee he didn't intend to sleep through, and sat in the chair facing the door with the rifle across his knees. He thought about what she'd told him, thought about the probability that she was lying, and put it at somewhere around 4%. He'd spent 12 years professionally evaluating whether people were telling the truth under extreme duress. Celeste Vaughn showed 0 indicators of deception and about 100 indicators of a person who had just survived something that should have killed her. He also thought about what it meant if she was telling the truth. Private contractors. Military movement discipline. A stepmother with state government connections and the apparent willingness to eliminate a witness. This was not a domestic dispute. This was a coordinated elimination operation running against a civilian target on American soil, which meant either law enforcement had been compromised at some level or the people behind it believed they could clean up the problem before any law enforcement found out it existed. Neither option was comfortable. Around 2 a.m., Celeste spoke from the couch. He hadn't realized she was awake. Why are you doing this? He didn't pretend not to understand the question. You showed up at my fence. That's not an answer. It's the one I've got. He drank some coffee. Go to sleep. A long pause. Daniel? Yeah. Thank you. He didn't say anything to that. Ranger shifted by the door, resettled, and went quiet. The fire cracked. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like static. He let her sleep until 6. Then he made eggs and toast because she needed calories, and because moving on an empty stomach was amateur, and when she came to the table she moved carefully, favoring the left side. But she moved under her own power, which was a reasonable indicator. We need to establish a few things, he said, sliding the plate toward her. The documentation you mentioned. Where is it? A secure cloud server. I have the access credentials memorized, not on a device. I haven't had a device in 8 days. Good. So the evidence is intact. Unless Helena's people found the account, but it requires 2-factor authentication tied to a phone number she doesn't know exists and a password that isn't written anywhere. She looked at him. My father wasn't a stupid man. I learned from him. Is there anyone you can contact? Anyone clean? She thought about it seriously, which he appreciated. Not a reflexive yes or a dramatic no one. She actually ran the names. My father had a lawyer, Martin Ellery. He's been my family's attorney for 30 years, and he's the one who helped my father set up the account to begin with. If Helena hasn't gotten to him, we'll have to assume she's tried. Does he have a secondary contact? Someone you'd reach if you couldn't reach him directly? His daughter, she went to law school with me. We were close. A pause. We were. He filed that. And federal connections? Anyone you trust outside of state jurisdiction? My father had a relationship with a U.S. attorney in Denver, separate from anything Golt could influence. She stopped eating. Why are you asking like you're planning something? Because I am. She looked at him for a moment. You believe me. I believe you. He refilled his coffee. I also believe that whoever's running this operation didn't stop looking when they lost your trail. They're methodical. That means they're working a grid, and eventually the grid hits this property. How long do we have? He considered. If they're working from the crash site outward, covering ground at a reasonable pace in these conditions, assuming they have a team of 8 to 12 and they're using vehicle and foot elements. He did the math. Somewhere between 18 and 36 hours. Maybe less if they're using aerial assets. She put her fork down. So what do we do? He stood up, carried his plate to the sink, and looked out the window at the tree line. Gray morning light. No wind yet. The snow from last night still clean and unmarked except for his own tracks. First, he said, we get that evidence to someone who can move on it. Second, we make sure that when they get here, he heard it before he finished the sentence. Ranger was on his feet by the door, every muscle locked, a low sound building in his chest that Daniel hadn't heard since overseas. Not barking, something deeper, something that meant not an animal, not a stranger, something that knows what it's doing. Daniel crossed the room in 4 steps and killed the kitchen light. Through the window, at the far end of the ranch road, he could see them now. Headlights. Multiple sets. Moving slow, in column, no distance between them. Professional spacing. And they were coming with their lights on, which meant they weren't trying to hide anymore. They were done looking. They'd already found her. 3 vehicles. Maybe 4. The headlights spread as they cleared the tree line at the end of the ranch road, separating from column into a loose line abreast. A flanking formation, not a civilian approach. Nobody drove like that to ask for directions. Daniel stepped back from the window and kept his voice flat. How many people knew the general direction you were moving? Celeste was already on her feet, one hand pressed to her left side. Nobody. I told you. Think harder. A phone call? A text? Anything before you lost your device. Did you ever tell someone you were heading toward Sheridan? Toward the north? She went still. Her eyes moved to the middle distance the way people's eyes did when they were actually searching memory instead of performing it. My father's lawyer, Ellery. I called him from a gas station in Gillette 6 days ago, before I lost the burner. I didn't say where I was going, but I said I was moving north. She looked at him. He might not have had a choice. Daniel was already moving, pulling the rifle from the corner and checking the chamber. Round seated, safety on. He crossed to the cabinet under the stairs and opened it. They've had 8 days to work every contact in your life. If they got to Ellery, they got the call record. If they got the call record, they triangulated north of Gillette and worked a grid. He pulled a second rifle, a shorter, suppressed AR platform carbine, and set it on the table. It's not a leak. It's math. She stared at the cabinet, at the rifles, at the chest rig he was pulling over his head. You keep all of that under your stairs. I keep all of that everywhere. He tightened the chest rig, checked the magazine pouches. Full. He'd restocked 2 weeks ago out of a habit he'd told himself was irrational. Can you shoot? My father took me hunting every year from age 9 to age 22. That's not what I asked. A beat. Yes, I can shoot. He handed her the suppressed carbine. 14 rounds in the mag, 1 in the chamber. Safety here. Don't use it unless something comes through that door that I haven't cleared first. He picked up the primary rifle and moved to the window again, staying to the edge of the frame, out of the line of sight from outside. The vehicles had stopped at the property gate 200 meters out. He counted the headlights. 4 vehicles. They were leaving their engines running, exhaust plumes rising in the cold, which meant they weren't trying to preserve stealth. They knew where she was. They were done being careful. A door opened. A figure stepped out and stood in the headlight wash, and even at 200 meters, Daniel could read the posture. Tactical kit. Plate carrier. Helmet with night optics flipped up. This wasn't a hired thug in a suit. This was someone who had done this before, probably professionally, and probably not in a context that involved rules of engagement. He counted bodies as they dismounted. 7 visible. At least 2 staying with the vehicles, which put him at a probable total of 9 to 12. Against 1 man, 1 wounded woman, and a dog. He'd worked with worse arithmetic. Get away from the windows, he said, without looking at her. Low. Move to the back hallway and stay there. I'm not hiding in a hallway I'm not asking you to hide. I'm asking you to be somewhere I don't have to worry about you while I do the first part. He turned and looked at her directly. The moment I need you shooting, I will tell you. Until then, you being shot again helps nobody. Clear? She didn't like it. He could see that plainly. But she moved. He went out the back. The temperature hit him like a wall. Still 9 degrees, maybe 8 now, with a wind that had picked up in the last hour and was carrying fine snow off the drifts in horizontal sheets. He moved low and fast along the back of the cabin, staying in the shadow of the eave where the snow was packed hard and his boots made almost no sound. Ranger came with him, tucked to his left heel, and Daniel made a single hand signal, spread and flank, that the dog responded to immediately, breaking right and disappearing into the dark. He'd built 4 hides on this property. Not out of paranoia, he told himself, out of habit. 2 years after separating, he'd spent a long weekend walking the terrain and identifying fields of fire, cover, and concealment, approach routes, choke points. He told himself it was therapeutic. What he'd actually done was built a defensive fighting position around a civilian ranch in rural Wyoming, which probably said something about him that he didn't want to examine too closely. The first hide was a shallow scrape behind the woodpile, elevated slightly, with clear sight lines down the ranch road and across the open ground in front of the cabin. He moved into it, settled, got the rifle up, and scanned through the optic. The lead element was moving. 3 men, staying spread, moving at a crouch toward the fence line. Good spacing, 7 to 10 meters between each, which meant they'd been trained not to cluster. They were using the low ground on the left side of the road, staying out of the moonlight where they could, but the fresh snow was working against them. Every step broke through the crust and left a dark hole. They were traceable from 50 meters away. He watched them and made a decision, non-lethal first. He needed to understand the command structure before he started dropping people, because a commander losing bodies did one of 2 things. He pulled back to reassess, or he escalated hard and fast. Daniel needed the former. If he hit 3 bodies in the first 30 seconds, the escalation response would be immediate and overwhelming, and he'd be in a straight attritional fight that he would eventually lose. But if he disrupted their approach, caused confusion, made them think the perimeter was more heavily defended than it was, then he bought time. Time was the one resource that would actually matter here, because time meant morning. Morning meant a satellite phone call he'd been putting off making for 2 years. And that call meant a chain of events that might actually end this without everyone dying in a Wyoming snowfield. He waited until the lead element crossed the fence line. Let them get 20 meters into the property. Then he fired twice, aimed shots, not at the men, at the ground in front of them. The rounds hit the frozen earth less than a meter ahead of the lead figure, and the sound and the impact spray were enough. All 3 went flat. He was already moving before they hit the ground. He relocated to the second hide, the irrigation ditch along the east fence, in under a minute. Low crawl, wet, miserable, snow packing into his collar and his sleeves. He got there and came up in time to see one of the remaining vehicles trying to push through the gate on the south side. Someone had decided that direct entry was better than a flanking approach, which was either impatient or it was deliberate, trying to split his attention. He let the vehicle through the gate. It rolled onto the property, slowed, stopped. The driver was scanning. The passenger window came down. Someone leaned out with what looked like thermal optics, scanning the tree line. Ranger hit the rear tire on the driver's side. Not the tire, the man who stepped out to get a better look from behind the vehicle. The dog came out of the dark at full speed, 100 pounds of trained military working dog moving in absolute silence until the moment of contact, which was not silent at all. The man went down hard, rifle clattering on the frozen ground. Ranger didn't hold. He was already breaking away before the passenger could respond, back into the dark. 2 seconds of confusion, 2 seconds of shouting in the dark. Daniel used them. He moved to the third hide, the stack of old railway ties behind the barn, and came up behind the 2-man element that had stopped short of the cabin's front door. They were in communication with someone, one of them speaking quietly into a radio mounted on his chest, and Daniel was close enough to hear fragments. East side is compromised. Bravo's down at the hold position. Command wants confirmation before. Confirmation of what? There's someone out here. This isn't. Daniel stepped on a patch of ice, and his boots skidded 6 inches. Both men spun. He dropped the one on the right first. Not a shot, a controlled tackle, using his weight and momentum to put the man into the ground before he could fire, and the rifle discharged into the dirt. Once, a sharp crack that echoed off the barn wall. The second man swung his weapon, and Daniel was already inside the arc of it, one hand controlling the muzzle, the other driving an elbow into the man's jaw with enough force to put him down in 2 steps. Neither was dead. Both were done. He pulled the radio off the downed man's chest rig and pressed the earpiece in. All elements report. Cross-reference the thermal on the north approach. Whoever's moving out there isn't a civilian. A pause, then a different voice, calmer, more measured. Pull back to the road. Reform. We're going to do this properly. Pulling back. Good. They were reassessing, but the calm voice worried him. That was the voice of someone who wasn't rattled, someone who had pulled back not out of fear, but out of professional methodology. Someone who understood that the situation had changed and was calmly adjusting. That kind of opponent was more dangerous, not less. He keyed the radio, said nothing. Just let them hear the open channel for 3 seconds, then released. Let them wonder who was listening. Then he moved back toward the cabin. Celeste was not in the back hallway. She was in the kitchen, at the window, carbine in hand, watching the road with the safety off and her finger indexed along the receiver. Trigger discipline intact, which meant she hadn't been lying about knowing how to handle a weapon. I told you. There are 2 of them at the gate who didn't move with the others. She didn't look away from the window. They've been stationary for 4 minutes. One of them made a phone call. He looked. She was right. 2 figures at the property gate, not moving, one of them with a phone to his ear rather than a radio. Not contractors. Or not the same type. Overwatch, he said. They're reporting to someone outside the tactical element. To Helena. Or to whoever Helena's husband assigned to manage this. He moved to the cabinet and pulled out the satellite phone he kept for emergencies and hadn't used in 14 months. Which means there's a command layer above the contractors that we haven't seen yet. She finally turned from the window. Her color was better than it had been 2 hours ago, but she was holding herself carefully, and the bandage on her left side had shown through her shirt, not soaking, just stress weeping, which meant she hadn't torn anything, yet. You said you were going to make a call. Yeah. Who? He held the phone for a moment. A man I used to work with. He's retired now, runs a consulting firm in Bethesda that is mostly not a consulting firm. He looked at her. He has relationships with the kind of federal prosecutors who don't take calls from state officials. She was quiet. Then, you've been out for 3 years. Right. He'll still pick up? Daniel turned the phone on. He'll pick up. I wasn't entirely sure that was true, but he needed it to be, so he said it like it was. The call lasted 4 minutes. The man's name was Garrett. He didn't use a last name on calls and hadn't for as long as Daniel had known him. He'd been Daniel's commanding officer for 6 years and his most consistent point of contact in the part of the intelligence community that officially didn't have points of contact. When Daniel had separated, Garrett had given him a card with a single number on it and said, "Call if you ever have a problem you can't solve alone." The card was in a fireproof box under the floorboards in the bedroom. Daniel had it memorized. Garrett answered on the second ring. It was not quite 7 in the morning. Cross. I've got a situation. You've been telling me that for 3 years by not calling. Garrett, talk. Daniel talked. He gave it to him in the format of an operational brief. Situation, enemy, terrain, troops available, mission, execution, because that was the format Garrett received information fastest. He mentioned Vaughn. He mentioned Galt. He mentioned the evidence and the secure server. He described the tactical element that had just been repelled and the command layer still sitting at his gate. There was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough to mean Garrett was taking it seriously. The woman's alive. Yes. And you have the credentials for the evidence account. She does. Another pause. Cross, what I'm about to ask you is not a small thing. I know. Can you hold that position for 12 hours? He looked out the window. The vehicles at the gate had not moved. The 2 figures were still there. The tactical element had reformed somewhere in the dark at the road's edge, which meant they were regrouping, not leaving. Depends on whether they escalate the size of the element. I'll make 2 calls in the next 20 minutes. If I can get the right federal prosecutor on record with what you've told me, there will be people moving toward your location from Denver and Cheyenne within the hour. But Cross, a pause. They can't move if the woman's dead. You understand what I'm saying. Understood. 12 hours. I'll manage. He ended the call and set the phone on the table. Celeste was watching him from across the room. Well? He's making calls. He moved to the window again. We've got some time. Not a lot. Define not a lot. Enough. He looked at the gear he'd laid out on the table. Spare magazines. A box of fragmentation grenades he'd never been able to fully explain to himself why he owned. 2 radio units he'd bought at a military surplus sale in Casper and kept charged. A road flare. Get the second radio, channel 7. If we get separated, that's how we talk. She crossed to the table and picked up the radio, turned it over in her hands. She was steady. Her hands weren't shaking. He noticed that. You built this place to be defended, she said. It wasn't a question. I built this place to be alone. Same thing, it sounds like. He didn't answer that. Outside, the wind had dropped slightly, and in the new quiet, he could hear something. The creak of the gate. The overwatch element at the road had moved. One of them was walking toward the cabin now, slowly, hands visible, no weapon raised, approaching under a flag of negotiation, which was interesting because professional contractors didn't negotiate. They executed. The fact that someone was walking toward his door with their hands visible meant the command layer had changed tactics. They weren't trying to take Celeste quietly anymore. They were trying something else. Stay in the hallway, he said. You keep saying that. This time I mean it differently. He moved to the door. Someone wants to talk. That means they want something they don't have yet, which means we have more leverage than I thought. He opened the door before the man reached the porch. The figure stopped 6 feet from the bottom step. Male, mid-40s, plate carrier but rifle slung muzzle down and hands in the open. Square face, close-cropped hair, the flat effect of someone who did this for money rather than belief. Mr. Cross, the man's voice was even, professional. My employer would like to resolve this without further incident. Your employer started it. My employer is prepared to offer a substantial sum to facilitate. Who's your employer? A slight pause. I'm not at liberty. You came to my door, Daniel said. You knocked. You want to have a conversation? We're going to have an honest one. Who sent you? The man's eyes moved to the space behind Daniel, trying to see into the cabin, checking for Celeste. The woman in your home is in possession of materials that constitute a threat to who? To several parties who have significant interest in ensuring the Vaughn estate is settled without. You're a long way from an estate lawyer. Daniel stepped forward 1 step onto the porch. The man didn't move back, but his weight shifted. You've got 9 men on my property. 2 of them are not going to be comfortable tonight. You've got Overwatch at the gate reporting to someone who is scared enough to send a negotiator instead of a second wave. He tilted his head slightly. Tell your employer that the materials in question are already beyond her reach. Tell her that federal involvement is 12 hours away. Tell her that the best outcome available to her right now involves her attorney and a prosecutor who is not connected to Raymond Gold. The man's expression didn't change, but something behind the eyes did. I'll pass that along. You do that. The man turned and walked back toward the gate. No hurry, professional to the end. Daniel watched him go, then stepped back inside and closed the door. The fire had died down while he was outside. The cabin was cold. He added 2 logs and stood over the stove with his hands out, watching the flames catch. Ranger came in from somewhere. Daniel hadn't even known the dog was back inside, and pressed against his leg. He put 1 hand on the dog's neck. From the hallway, Celeste spoke. What did he say? That his employer wants to resolve this. He straightened up. Which means Helena's scared. She's not scared, she's calculating. A pause, and Celeste appeared in the hallway doorway, the carbine still in her hands. She's always calculating. When she's doing this, she gestured vaguely toward the gate, toward the whole situation. She's not panicking, she's buying time, the same way you are. He looked at her. What does that mean for the next 12 hours? She met his eyes, and for the first time since he'd carried her out of the snow, what he saw in her face wasn't exhaustion or fear or the blunt shock of a person in survival mode. It was something clearer, something that had been there underneath all of it, waiting. It means she's already planning her next move, Celeste said, and it won't look like men with guns. She was right. He knew it the moment she said it. He crossed to the window and looked at the gate. The negotiator had reached the vehicles. The Overwatch figures were speaking to him. One of them reached for a phone. The vehicles didn't leave. They turned off their headlights. All of them. At once. Which was worse than leaving, because it meant they were settling in. It meant they'd accepted a waiting game. It meant Helena had communicated something new to the people at his gate, some adjusted strategy that didn't require them to assault his position tonight. It meant they had something else coming. He just didn't know what it was yet. Outside, the Wyoming dark swallowed the ranch road whole, And the only sound was the wind in the pines and Ranger's breathing and the fire that was starting, finally, to push some warmth back into the room. I gave the darkness 2 hours. 2 hours of watching the gate from the window in 10-minute rotations, trading off with Celeste, so neither of them went hollow-eyed from staring into black nothing. 2 hours of radio silence from the vehicles parked on his road, their outlines barely visible in the moonlight. Engine exhaust, the only sign they were still occupied. 2 hours of Ranger moving restlessly between the front door and the back, unable to settle, which was its own kind of intelligence report. At 4 in the morning, Daniel made a decision. "I'm going to push their perimeter," he told Celeste. "Not to engage, I need to know if they've been reinforced." She looked up from the table where she'd been sitting with a cup of water and the carbine across her knees. "How will you know?" "Vehicle count, radio traffic if they're sloppy." He was already pulling on the dark outer layer he'd worn earlier, shaking the snow out of it. If Helena's adjusting strategy, she'd need to bring in additional assets. That takes time, and it takes vehicles. I want to know if the number changed. And if it did? He checked the rifle. Then 12 hours becomes a problem. She didn't say anything to that. She just nodded, the way someone nodded when they understood that the truth was bad, and arguing about it wouldn't make it less so. He went out the back again. The cold had deepened. Somewhere around 0 now, the kind of temperature that turned everything sharp and brittle. Snow that crunched under his boots despite every effort to move quietly. Breath that fogged even through the balaclava he'd pulled over his face. He moved along the eastern fence line, staying low, using the shadows of the fence posts as a broken kind of concealment. Ranger was with him for 30 meters. Then he sent the dog wide left with a hand signal, and the animal dissolved into the dark without a sound. He got to within 40 meters of the gate and went flat. Counted. 6 vehicles now, not 4. 2 had been added in the last 2 hours, both of them dark SUVs with no markings. He watched them for 5 minutes, tracking movement through the windows, and counted a minimum of 4 additional bodies. That put the total force at somewhere between 15 and 20, which changed the math considerably. He also saw something else. A woman standing at the rear of the second new vehicle, phone pressed to her ear, dressed in a long coat that was too elegant for a Wyoming ranch road at 4 in the morning. Even at 40 meters in the dark, the posture was unmistakable. The kind of stillness that came from a person who was accustomed to being the one giving orders and never having to justify them to anyone. He hadn't expected her to be here personally. He'd expected a remote operator, someone managing this from a warm office in Cheyenne or Denver, insulated by enough layers of deniability that nothing could touch her directly. The fact that Helena Vaughn was standing 40 meters from his gate at 4 in the morning meant one of 2 things. Either she had information that made her confident enough to be present for the resolution, or she was scared enough that she didn't trust anyone else to manage it. Both possibilities were dangerous, but in different ways. He watched her for another minute. She finished the call, said something to the man standing nearest to her. Shorter exchange, decisive, the body language of someone issuing a final instruction, and then turned and got back into the SUV. He moved back to the cabin. "She's here," he told Celeste. The effect was immediate. Not panic. Celeste didn't panic. He was starting to understand that about her. But a physical response, a tightening in the jaw, a stillness in the hands that suggested she was managing something that very much wanted to come out differently. In person. Standing at the gate 20 minutes ago. That means she's not planning to wait you out. Celeste set down the cup. If she were waiting for you to give up or run, she'd stay in Cheyenne and let the contractors handle it. She's here because she's planning to escalate and she wants to be present when it resolves. He pulled the balaclava off and sat down. The fire needed a log, but he didn't move to add one. What's her escalation look like? Not in contractor terms. In Helena terms. How does she think? Celeste was quiet for a moment, long enough that he could tell she was being precise, not slow. She uses leverage, she said finally. She doesn't fight directly if she can avoid it. When she wanted my father's physician to change his medication protocol, she didn't threaten him. She found something in his history, a malpractice settlement from 12 years ago, and made him understand that his professional reputation was contingent on her goodwill. She paused. She poisoned my father for 2 years. She is not impatient, but when she decides it's time to end something, she finds the thing you love most and she puts her hand on it. The sentence landed and sat there in the quiet cabin. I've been out here 3 years, Daniel said. I don't have much. You have a brother. He went still. Marcus, Celeste said. She'll have found him by now. It's what I would do. What she would do if a retired special operations soldier was the obstacle. You don't come at the soldier. You find his family. She met his eyes. Does your brother live close? Sheridan, 40 minutes south. Does he have children? Daniel stood up and moved to the satellite phone. 1. A nephew. Owen. He's 17. He dialed Marcus. It rang 4 times, 5, 6. Went to voicemail. He dialed again, same result. He checked his watch, 4:40 a.m. Marcus worked early shifts, was usually up by 5. Not answering at 4:40 was not necessarily alarming. It was also not nothing. He tried Marcus's wife. 3 rings, then a groggy voice. Hello? Sarah, it's Daniel. Where's Marcus? A pause, the rustling of someone sitting up. Daniel? It's not even 5. Where is he? Something in his voice got through. He heard her fully awake in under 2 seconds. He went out to check the truck. The battery's been giving him trouble. He went out maybe 20 minutes ago. Another pause. Longer. Daniel, what's happening? Lock the doors right now. Don't open them for anyone until you hear from me or until you see a federal badge with Denver jurisdiction. Not state. Federal. Can you do that? You're scaring me. Good. Lock the doors. He ended the call. Looked at Celeste, who had heard enough. Go, she said. I can't leave you here. I have a rifle and I have the radio, and they're not coming in here shooting because they need me alive to access my father's evidence. She said it matter-of-factly, as if she'd already worked through the logic while he was outside. They need me functional, and they need me willing to give them the server credentials, which means as long as I'm in this building, they won't breach hot. A pause. Marcus doesn't have that protection. He looked at her for a long moment. Everything about leaving felt wrong. Leaving a wounded civilian alone with 15 armed contractors on the perimeter, leaving on the basis of a threat that might not materialize, abandoning the defensive position he'd spent the night building. Every instinct he'd developed in 12 years of special operations said, hold your ground, maintain position, don't let them separate you from your objective. But Celeste was right, and he knew she was right, which made it worse. Channel 7, he said. Channel 7, she confirmed. He took the truck keys off the hook by the door. Then he stopped. The rifle in the cabinet, the bolt action, the one on the left side, do you see it? Yes. It's zeroed to 300 meters. The high ground behind the barn gives you a line of sight to the gate and down the road about 250 meters. He said it fast and clear. If they move on the cabin before I'm back, don't try to hold the door. Go to the high ground and make them come to you uphill through open snow. Pick your shots. Don't waste rounds on suppression. She crossed to the cabinet and pulled the bolt action without hesitation, checked the action, confirmed the magazine. How long? Hour and a half. Maybe less. Go. He went. He took the truck out the back track, a rutted maintenance road that ran along the eastern property line, and came out on a county road a mile south of the main gate. No lights until he was half a mile clear. The temperature gauge on the dash read -4, and the truck's heater took 3 minutes to start pushing warm air, and by then he was already on the county road heading south, pushing the old F-250 as fast as the packed snow would allow, which was faster than was probably wise. He called Garrett on the satellite phone with one hand. Garrett answered in 2 rings. Talk. Helena's on site. She's escalated to 20 personnel. I need the timeline moved up. I can't move federal response faster than the law allows, Cross. I'm not asking about federal response. I'm telling you the tactical picture has changed, and I need you to know the location of my brother's residence in Sheridan. He gave the address. If I'm right about how she operates, there's already a vehicle watching that house. A pause. I'll make a call. Don't make a call. Find me a Sheridan County deputy who takes orders from someone clean and get eyes on that house in the next 15 minutes. Cross Garrett. Another pause. A longer one. Give me 10 minutes. He pushed the truck harder. Marcus's house was a split level on a quiet street on the north end of Sheridan, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew their neighbors and left their garage doors unlocked. The driveway had an older Chevy pickup and a minivan, both with an inch of overnight snow on the roofs, meaning neither had moved since last evening, which was mildly reassuring. The house lights were off, except for a single lamp in the front room. He drove past first, checked the parked vehicles. A gray sedan he didn't recognize sitting 3 houses down with the engine running, exhaust visible. Driver inside, posture forward, not a person waiting casually. He parked 2 blocks over, behind a hardware store that wouldn't open for 4 hours, and walked back through backyards and alleys the way he'd learned to move through urban terrain, always perpendicular to the most obvious approach, never in a straight line. He came up behind the gray sedan from the passenger side. He'd planned to be quiet about it. Pull the driver out, subdue him, move on. That was the plan. Then he saw what the driver was watching, not the house. The alley beside the house, where Marcus's truck was parked with the hood up, and where Marcus himself was standing, talking to 2 men Daniel didn't recognize. And the way Marcus was standing, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he kept glancing toward his front door, told Daniel everything he needed to know about whether this was a casual conversation. He gave up on quiet. He opened the sedan door before the driver could react, had him by the collar and out of the vehicle in 2 seconds, and pressed him face first against the car's roof. Quick search. Holstered sidearm, 2 spare magazines, a zip tie kit in the jacket pocket. He took the weapon, secured the man's hands behind him with his own zip ties, and left him seated on the ground between the car and the curb where he'd be uncomfortable and visible and not able to do much about either. Then he walked toward the alley. He didn't announce himself. He just walked up to the 3 men, Marcus and the 2 strangers, and stopped 4 feet away, and the 2 strangers turned to look at him and immediately understood from his expression and his posture and the weapon in his hand that the conversation had changed. "Marcus," he said, without looking at his brother, "go inside." "Daniel, inside, right now." The 2 strangers exchanged a look. The one on the left tried to recover. An easy, open hands gesture, a reasonable face, the whole performance of a person who wants to seem unthreatening. "Mr. Cross, we're here on behalf of a client who simply wants to—" "I already heard the pitch," Daniel said. "It didn't take. Your brother and his family don't have to be involved in this. That's entirely up to—" "Get in the truck." Both men went still. "My truck," Daniel said. He wasn't raising his voice. He wasn't threatening. He was simply saying the next thing that was going to happen, in the same tone someone used to tell a child to put on their coat. "Front seat, both of you, right now. Or I'm going to call the Sheridan County Sheriff's Office and explain why 2 men with no local addresses are standing in my brother's driveway at 5 in the morning. And then the nice federal investigators who are currently driving here from Denver are going to have 2 extra people to interview." He tilted his head slightly. "Your choice. Make it fast." They got in the truck. He turned to Marcus. His brother was 53 and looked it, the kind of man who had spent 30 years working in weather and terrain, and it showed in every line of his face. He was staring at Daniel with an expression that was equal parts scared and furious. "You want to tell me what the hell?" "Later." Daniel put a hand on his brother's shoulder. "Brief, solid. You and Sarah and Owen stay inside. Don't answer the door. I'll explain everything in a few hours. Owen's not here. He had an early hockey practice. He left at 4:30. Daniel stopped. "Where?" "The rink on Commerce. It starts at 5. He does it every—" Marcus stopped talking because Daniel's expression had changed, and Marcus had known his brother long enough to understand when something had shifted into a different register. Daniel reached for the satellite phone. Garrett didn't answer. He called the number a second time. Voicemail. He tried the alternate contact number Garrett had given him years ago, a line that was supposed to be monitored around the clock. It rang 8 times. He was already moving back toward the truck when the radio on his hip crackled. Celeste's voice came through, tight and controlled and very, very careful. "Daniel? I'm here. There's a vehicle approaching the cabin from the south track, not the main road, the maintenance road." A pause. 1 beat. "And someone called me on the cabin landline 30 seconds ago. A woman. She said to tell you that your nephew is with her and that she'll be at your front gate in 20 minutes and that you should come back alone." He stopped walking. The temperature was -4 and the street was empty, and somewhere across town a 17-year-old kid named Owen was in a vehicle with Helena Vaughn, and Daniel was standing in an alley in Sheridan with 2 contractors zip-tied in his truck and 12 hours that had just collapsed into 20 minutes. He got back in the truck. The two men in the front seat looked at him when he climbed in the back, and whatever they saw in his face made them look away again quickly, which was the correct instinct. He called Celeste back. "Tell me exactly what she said." Celeste repeated it word for word, the way someone repeated something they'd known they would need to recall precisely. Helena's voice had been pleasant, she said, not threatening, just informational, the way a person relayed a schedule change. "She said your nephew was fine," Celeste added. She emphasized that he was fine, and that he could remain fine if you and I came to the gate together. Daniel stared at the windshield for a moment. The heater was blowing hard, and the two men in the front seat were very still, and outside the first gray light of morning was starting at the eastern edge of the sky. 20 minutes. He had 20 minutes and 45 miles, and two men in his front seat he needed to offload somewhere, and a 17-year-old who had gone to hockey practice and ended up in the middle of something that had nothing to do with him. He pulled the truck into gear. "Tell her we'll be there," he said into the radio. A silence from Celeste's end, short but real. "Are we sure?" "We're going to the gate," he said, "but we're not going to do what she's expecting." He didn't explain it further. He didn't have the 20 minutes to spare. He had the beginning of a plan, which was different from a plan, and he had a brother standing in a driveway watching him drive away, and he had Ranger alone at the ranch with a wounded woman and a bolt-action rifle, and the particular kind of trust that gets extended to someone not because they've earned it completely, but because there isn't anyone else. He drove south into the thinning dark. The first faint light came up over the mountains to the east, painting the snow pale gray, and then, slowly, the color of cold copper. Somewhere ahead, Helena Vaughn was waiting. She thought she had already won. She didn't know what he had become in the years since anyone had last tested him. She was about to find out. He offloaded the two contractors at the Sheridan County Sheriff's substation. Not inside. He pulled up to the curb, cut the engine, and turned to look at them in the front seat. They'd been quiet the entire drive, which was the professional response and also the correct one given the circumstances. "Out," he said. The one on the left, the talker, the one who'd tried the reasonable face routine in the alley, looked at him. "You're just leaving us here. I'm leaving you somewhere warm with people who are legally obligated to process you. Consider it a courtesy." He reached past them and pushed the passenger door open. "Your hands are zip-tied, and you're outside a law enforcement facility at 5:15 in the morning. Someone will find you in about 10 minutes. Don't run. It'll make everything worse." They got out. He watched them in the mirror until they reached the substation entrance, then pulled back onto the road and pushed the truck south. He called Celeste on the radio. "I'm 25 minutes out. What's the situation at the gate?" Her voice came back clear, controlled. "Same vehicle count. No movement toward the cabin. Helena's SUV is still at the front. Someone brought a portable light unit. They've got the gate area lit up now." "Owen?" "I haven't seen him. She said she'd be at the gate in 20 minutes, and that was—" A pause while she calculated. 38 minutes ago. So Helena had already reset the timeline once, which meant she was managing this at her own pace, making them wait, which was a power move and also an information move. She was watching to see how they responded to the pressure of uncertainty before she made her next step. "Is Ranger with you?" "He showed up at the back door about 20 minutes ago. He's here." Some of the tension in his chest loosened fractionally. "Good. Keep him inside." "Daniel." A pause. She called again. 5 minutes ago. He waited. "She wants Celeste at the gate, not you, just Celeste. She says if Celeste walks out to the gate alone and surrenders the server credentials verbally, Owen comes home and everyone drives away." He drove in silence for a moment. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I needed to speak with you first." Another pause. "She gave me 10 minutes. Don't go to the gate." "I know. I mean it." "Daniel, I know." Her voice was flat and certain. "I've spent 8 days running from this woman. I'm not walking out to meet her in the dark because she asked nicely." He exhaled. 10 minutes is enough time. I'll be there." He pushed the truck to 70 on the packed snow road, which was the edge of what the tires would hold, and held it there. He came in from the south, on the maintenance track, lights off for the last half mile, parked behind the barn, and went the rest of the way on foot, moving along the interior fence line, staying in the tree shadows, Ranger appearing at his side from nowhere as he crossed the back of the property. The dog had heard him coming before he'd cleared the tree line. He put a hand on Ranger's neck, felt the dog's tension, the way every muscle was set and ready. "Easy," he said quietly. "Not yet." He got to the corner of the barn and looked around it toward the gate. The portable light unit was a tripod-mounted LED flood, the kind construction crews used for night work, and it had turned the 40 meters around the gate into a bright, flat arena. Helena's SUV was positioned with its nose toward the gate, driver's side facing the cabin. He could see her through the windshield, or someone in that seat. The light wasn't quite right for faces at this distance. 4 contractors visible, spread in a loose perimeter, professional spacing, weapons up but not aimed. And Owen. His nephew was sitting on the hood of one of the other SUVs, wrists bound in front of him with what looked like a zip tie, wearing a hockey jersey and sweatpants and no coat in -4-degree weather. He was trying not to show that he was cold, which was the kind of stubbornness Daniel recognized from his own family. He took 20 seconds to read the whole picture. Guard positions, angles, what was lit and what wasn't. The floodlight created a clear zone, but it also destroyed the guard's night vision. Anyone who'd been looking at that light for more than 5 minutes was going to be functionally blind in the dark areas around it. He pressed the radio. "Celeste, here, come to the front window. Tell me what you can see from your angle." A 30-second pause. 2 men on the left side of the gate, one on the right. The SUV in the center. "I can see someone in the driver's seat. Your nephew is on the hood of the second vehicle, left side. There's a man standing directly beside him. 1 man on Owen. 1 visible." He thought about it. 1 guard on Owen meant Owen was not the primary security concern in Helena's mind. She considered the threat of Owen's presence sufficient without devoting significant resources to actually containing him, which meant either she was confident or she was careless, or she understood that Daniel would not do anything that put Owen at direct risk, and therefore didn't need more than 1 guard to make the point. All 3 were probably true. He looked at his watch. Helena's 10-minute window had expired 4 minutes ago. As if she'd been watching the same clock, the SUV door opened. Helena Vaughn stepped out. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, composed in the way of someone who had decided a long time ago that composure was power and practiced it until it became automatic. She wore the long coat she'd been wearing at the gate 2 hours earlier, and she walked to the front of her vehicle and stood in the floodlight as if she'd arranged the whole scene for exactly this: the light, the positioning, the tableau of a woman in control. She spoke toward the cabin, her voice carried clearly in the cold air. "Miss Vaughn, I think we've spent enough time on this." Silence from the cabin. "You've been very resourceful, genuinely. 8 days through the mountains is not something I would have predicted." A pause. "Your father would have been proud, I imagine." Daniel watched from the shadow of the barn. He could feel Ranger trembling beside him, not from cold, from restraint. Helena continued. "The evidence you've compiled is not as secure as you believe. The server account was identified 2 days ago. We haven't accessed it yet because doing so without your credentials risks triggering a backup distribution protocol that your father's lawyer helpfully mentioned before he reconsidered his position." A beat. "So you see, we need you specifically, not dead, not incapacitated, just cooperative." A long pause. Then the cabin door opened. Daniel went rigid. Celeste stepped onto the porch. She had the bolt-action rifle slung across her back, muzzle down, and she walked to the top of the porch steps and stopped there, 20 meters from the gate, lit from one side by the floodlight and from the other by the faint glow from the cabin windows. She looked, Daniel thought, nothing like a person who had been shot and had spent 8 days in the mountains. She looked like exactly who she was, Warren Vaughn's daughter, who had been in boardrooms before she was old enough to drive, and who knew what it meant to stand in a room where everyone wanted something from you and give them nothing. "My father's lawyer," Celeste said. "Did he tell you what's in the secondary cache?" Helena's composure flickered. One small movement, barely visible, a slight shift of weight. "There is no secondary cache. He set it up the same week he set up the primary account. I didn't know about it until he told me, 3 days before he died. It's not a server." She paused. "It's physical. Documents, recordings, and a sworn and notarized written statement. It's already in the custody of a federal court clerk in Denver under a sealed filing that opens automatically if Ellery doesn't send a specific confirmation code every 72 hours. Another pause. His next confirmation window closed 6 hours ago. Helena was very still. My father didn't trust one method, Celeste said. He trusted redundancy. The silence stretched. In it, Daniel moved. He came around the right side of the barn at a low run, staying out of the floodlight's reach, cutting toward the SUV where Owen was sitting. The guard beside Owen had his attention on Celeste at the porch. Everyone's attention was on Celeste at the porch, which was exactly what she'd intended, Daniel understood, by walking out there. She hadn't walked out there in surrender. She'd walked out there to give him 30 seconds. He reached the SUV from the blind side, came around the rear bumper, and the guard registered movement. 1 second too late, Daniel had him by the collar and the wrist, controlling the weapon arm, putting him down against the vehicle's side panel in a controlled takedown that made noise but not the kind that carried. Owen was off the hood in the same moment, moving on instinct, and Daniel grabbed his arm. With me. Move. Owen didn't ask questions. He ran. Daniel got them behind the barn in 12 seconds. He pressed Owen against the wall and took a fast look at his hands. Zip tie. Simple. He cut it with the folding knife from his chest pocket. You okay? Owen was 17 and trying very hard not to look 17. His jaw was set and his eyes were clear, and he was shaking slightly, which was cold and adrenaline and not, Daniel thought, fear. I'm okay. He looked at his uncle's face. That lady is insane. Yeah. He gripped the back of Owen's neck briefly. 1 second. Stay behind the barn. Down low. Do not move until I come back for you. What are you? Owen. The boy went low and still. Daniel moved back toward the gate. The 30 seconds had expired. Helena had heard the noise from the SUV and the perimeter had tightened, 2 of the gate guards moving toward the barn side while the remaining 2 closed on the gate itself. Celeste was still on the porch, still standing, which was either courage or the knowledge that as long as she was visible and upright, the contractors wouldn't shoot. Daniel came out of the dark at the edge of the floodlight and walked directly toward Helena. 2 guards moved to intercept him. He didn't stop walking. I'm not armed, he said. He raised his hands to shoulder height, palms out. This was not entirely true. He had the folding knife and a compact sidearm at his back. But the contractors couldn't see the sidearm and he needed 5 more steps, and the statement bought them. He got the 5 steps. He stopped 8 feet from Helena. She looked at him. He looked at her. Up close, she was older than she'd seemed from a distance, or maybe not older, more precise. Everything about her face was intentional. The controlled expression, the way she held her chin, the slight angle of her shoulders. This was a person who had spent years managing how she appeared to people because appearing a certain way was how she controlled what they did. Mr. Cross? Her voice was perfectly even. You've made this considerably more difficult than it needed to be. That's kind of my thing. He kept his hands at shoulder height, kept his voice conversational. Your guard at the SUV is going to have a headache for a few days. My nephew is somewhere you can't reach him. Your contractors at the gate are getting cold and they're going to start wondering whether their fee covers whatever comes next. He tilted his head slightly. The federal response that's been building for the last 8 hours is about 40 minutes out. I have confirmation of that. He didn't have confirmation of that. He had Garrett's voice from 3 hours ago saying 12 hours, which was now down to 9, which meant 40 minutes was optimistic by about 8 hours. But Helena didn't know what he knew, and he needed her to make a decision in the next 60 seconds. She studied him. The server credentials. Gone. Whatever backup your people built into their access approach, it won't matter, because Celeste is going to log into that server in the next hour from a device that will be logged as the authenticated access point, and she's going to initiate the distribution protocol that sends everything to every federal address on the list her father compiled. He paused. Which includes, I'm told, 3 U.S. attorneys, a Senate investigative committee, and a journalist at the Denver Post whose father worked for Warren Vaughn for 20 years and who has been waiting for this specific call. Helena's jaw tightened. It was the first real crack. You're bluffing. Some of it, he said honestly, not the federal response, and not the secondary cache in Denver, which you just found out about 12 minutes ago and which you have no way to contain. He lowered his hand slowly, carefully, watching the contractors in his peripheral vision. You're a smart person, Mrs. Vaughn. You built something that should have worked. The problem is that Warren Vaughn was smarter, and he had 4 weeks of knowing something was wrong to build a contingency, and his daughter had 8 days in the mountains to decide that she wasn't going to let it end quietly. Helena said nothing. The floodlight hummed. The cold air sat on everything. "Call them off," he said. "All of it. The contractors here, whoever you have running secondary operations, whatever you've set up as a contingency for Raymond Gall. Make the calls." He nodded toward the phone she was holding. "I'll wait. And if I don't? Then I step back and we wait 40 minutes for the federal response, and whatever leverage you have in the next 40 minutes, you don't have afterward." He met her eyes. "You know how this ends. You're a person who calculates outcomes. Calculate this one." A long silence. She looked at the phone in her hand. Then she looked at the SUV where her guard was no longer standing. Then she looked toward the barn where Owen had disappeared. Then she looked at Celeste on the porch. Her face did something complicated. Not remorse. He didn't think Helena Vaughn had a remorse setting, but a kind of internal accounting, a person reviewing the numbers and finding that they no longer added up the way she needed. She raised the phone and made a call. He listened to her side of it. Short, clipped. The specific neutrality of a person who had practiced communicating bad news without sounding like they were communicating bad news. She used the word "stand down" twice. She named 2 locations that he assumed corresponded to secondary operations he hadn't known about. She ended the call and made a second one, shorter, and that one she ended by saying the words, "Cancel everything." When she lowered the phone, she looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite name. "This isn't finished," she said. "No," he agreed. "It's not." She got back in the SUV. The federal response arrived in 53 minutes, not 40, which was fine because the contractors had dispersed within 20 minutes of Helena's calls, and by the time the first vehicle with federal plates came up the ranch road, the only people on Daniel's property were Daniel, Celeste, Owen, Ranger, and a cold and quiet morning that was starting to show actual daylight at the mountain peaks to the east. There were 4 vehicles, 6 agents, 2 of them with U.S. attorney credentials. One of them, a woman in her 40s named Rice, who had the specific exhausted energy of someone who had been working phones since before dawn, asked to speak with Celeste first. Daniel pointed her toward the cabin and went to find Owen. His nephew was sitting behind the barn on an overturned feed bucket, both arms wrapped around himself for warmth. When he saw Daniel coming, he stood up with the particular dignity of a 17-year-old who has been frightened and is now determined not to show it. Daniel unzipped his outer jacket and held it out. Owen hesitated, then took it. "Your mom's going to be angry," Daniel said. "Yeah, at me, not at you." Owen pulled the jacket on. It was enormous on him. Who was that woman? Someone who made bad choices and got used to other people paying for them. Owen looked at him for a moment. "You okay? You've got blood on your collar." Daniel touched his neck. Somewhere in the night's movement, he'd caught something. A branch, a fence wire. He didn't remember, and hadn't noticed it. He brought his hand back with a thin smear of dried blood on his fingers. "I'm fine." "Uncle Daniel." Owen's voice was quieter. "What do you actually do out here? What do you actually do?" He looked at his nephew for a long moment. At the early morning light coming over the mountains, at the federal vehicles on his road, and the agents moving around his property with their badges out and their breath fogging in the cold. "I fix fences," he said. "Mostly." Owen looked at him with the expression of a 17-year-old who understood that adults said things they didn't mean and said nothing in response, which was, Daniel thought, more mature than most of what had happened in the last 12 hours. The debrief took 4 hours. Rice ran it, which meant it was organized and methodical and covered ground he hadn't expected. She had background on Helena that suggested the federal interest in the Vaughn estate had predated last night by several months, that there had been an existing inquiry into Raymond Golt's finances that had stalled for lack of a cooperating witness, and that Celeste's arrival, alive, documented, with access to a secondary evidence cache that had now been formally submitted to a federal court clerk in Denver, had broken something open that Rice's office had been trying to crack with considerably less success. "You could have called us," Rice said at one point, looking at Daniel across the kitchen table with an expression that wasn't quite accusatory but was close. "I did call someone." "Garrett." She said the name flatly, like she'd encountered it before in a context she didn't love, which is not the same as calling us. It got you here. It got us here 8 hours after an armed engagement on private property involving, she checked her notes, an estimated 15 to 20 contracted personnel. 17, he said. Estimated. She looked at him. Mr. Cross. Garrett said 12 hours. I managed 12 hours. He refilled his coffee. Would your office have moved faster without his call? A pause. That's not the point. It's exactly the point. She went back to her notes. Across the room, Celeste was speaking with a second agent, going through the server credentials, walking through the evidence architecture she and her father had built. She was calm and precise, and she spoke about her father without her voice changing, which cost her something. Daniel could see that, the slight tension around her eyes every time she said his name, but she didn't let it slow her down. At one point, she caught him watching and gave him a look that was not quite a smile, more like acknowledgement, more like, I see you, I'm still here. He looked away first. Rice closed her notebook at hour 4. She looked tired in the specific way of a person who had been right about something for months and was now experiencing the exhaustion of being proven right rather than the satisfaction. Helena Vaughn is in federal custody as of, she checked her phone, 40 minutes ago, picked up at a private airstrip outside Cheyenne. She was boarding a chartered flight. A pause. Raymond Galt was detained at his home this morning by agents from our Denver field office. His attorney is already filing injunctions, but given what's now in evidence, those are mostly delay tactics. Celeste, from across the room, spoke without looking up from the document she was reviewing. How long? Before charges? Rice considered. The toxicology evidence alone said, if it aligns with the financial records and the recording, the prosecutorial case is substantial. We're looking at premeditated homicide, conspiracy, obstruction, and a set of financial crimes that will take 18 months to fully document. She paused. This won't be fast. I know. Celeste finally looked up. I've been waiting 8 weeks since my father died. I can wait for it to be done right. Rice nodded. She started to say something else, then stopped. And what she did instead was close her notebook and look at Celeste with an expression that wasn't federal agent anymore. Just a person looking at another person. Your father built something very careful, she said. The secondary cache, the filing with the court clerk, the authentication protocol. He didn't have a lot of time, and he used it well. Celeste's jaw tightened, just for a second. He was always thorough. He trusted you to carry it. He didn't have many options. No, Rice said, but I think he also just knew. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, an agent was photographing the damage to the south fence gate. Through the window, Daniel could see 2 of the bureau vehicles, and beyond them the mountain line, and beyond that nothing but open sky. Celeste set down the document she'd been holding and looked at her hands. They were steady. He noticed that. After everything, 8 days in the mountains, a bullet wound, a night of contractors and floodlights, and a woman who had orchestrated her father's death, her hands were steady. She noticed him watching again. Stop, she said. I'm not doing anything. You're doing that thing where you're assessing whether I'm okay. I'm a thorough person. I'm fine. I know. She looked at him for a moment. Are you? He thought about it honestly, which was something he didn't always do. His shoulder had been grazed by something in the dark during the night. Not a bullet, he thought, a piece of fence wire or debris from a ricochet. And it had stiffened up in the cold and was now reminding him of its existence with steady, dull persistence. He hadn't slept in 31 hours. He had federal agents in his kitchen and tire tracks across his north pasture and 2 fence sections that needed to be rehung before the week was out. I've had worse weeks, he said. It wasn't really an answer. She accepted it anyway. Outside, Ranger sat on the porch watching the agents move around the property with the composed attention of a dog who had decided the crisis was over and was now simply monitoring to make sure nobody touched anything they shouldn't. His ears were finally still. It was the most relaxed Daniel had seen him in 24 hours. He took that for what it was worth. The federal vehicles left in the early afternoon. They took 4 hours of statements, 2 boxes of physical evidence that Daniel hadn't known he'd accumulated over the course of the night, spent casings, a zip tie, the radio unit he'd pulled off the downed contractor. and enough photographs of the property to document every fence post and tire track. Reese was the last one out the door. She shook Daniel's hand at the porch steps and gave Celeste her direct card, the one with the cell number handwritten on the back rather than printed, which meant something in the hierarchy of federal contact options. Someone from the U.S. Attorney's Office will be in touch within 48 hours, she said. Both of you will likely be called as witnesses. Keep your phones on. I don't have a phone, Daniel said. She looked at him. Get one. She walked to her vehicle, got in, drove up the ranch road and turned onto the county road, and was gone. And then the sound of her engine faded, and the ranch went quiet, in the particular way that it went quiet after something loud. Not peaceful, not yet, just the absence of noise where noise had been. Celeste stood beside him on the porch. She was wearing one of his flannel shirts over her own, which was several sizes too large and made her look simultaneously more human and more exhausted than she had looked during the entire federal debrief, where she'd been composed and precise and given nothing away. Now she leaned against the porch rail and looked at the tire tracks cut into the snow across the north pasture, and she was quiet for long enough that he didn't try to fill it. I need to call Ellery, she said finally. The real one, not whatever version of him Helena got to. There has to be something left of him that's salvageable. He's been my family's attorney for 30 years. Rice will have contacted him already. He may be in federal custody by now, depending on what he told Helena. I know. She turned the card over in her fingers. I'm not angry at him. Whatever she had on him, she always had something on everyone. That was her method. A pause. I'm just tired of accounting for what she destroyed. He didn't say anything to that because there wasn't anything useful to say, and he'd learned a long time ago that some statements weren't invitations for a response. They were just true things that needed to be said out loud so they could be heard by someone. Ranger came around the corner of the cabin, checked both of them with his nose, and lay down in the doorway. What happens to the estate? Daniel asked. It goes through probate. There are challenges. There will be more challenges from whatever attorneys Helena's people file through before her assets are frozen. She looked toward the mountains. Vaughn Industrial has a board and a management structure that's been operating without actual oversight for 8 weeks. There's going to be a period of genuine chaos. Can you manage it? She looked at him. I've been sitting in board meetings since I was 14. My father made sure I understood every part of the business. A slight pause. He made sure I understood it more than anyone knew I understood it. He was preparing you. He was preparing me, she confirmed. I think he knew, even before he was certain about Helena, that something might happen. He was that kind of person. Her jaw tightened briefly. He was also the kind of person who didn't say things directly if he could say them in a way that made you figure it out yourself, which I found infuriating and now find... She stopped. Yeah, Daniel said. She looked at him. A real look, not a functional one. You lost someone. Several someones. Someone specific. He was quiet for a moment. My team leader. 3 deployments together. He had a wife in Virginia Beach and a daughter who would have been about Owen's age by now. He looked at the mountains. He didn't come back from the last one. I did, and I came here. To punish yourself. To be somewhere quiet. Same thing. He didn't argue with that. Celeste had a way of saying true things without inflection, which was either something she'd inherited or something she'd developed, and he hadn't decided which. You can't stay here forever, she said. I own the property. That's not what I mean. I know what you mean. He put his hands in his pockets. The shoulder that had been grazed the night before had stiffened further in the cold afternoon air and was starting to produce the specific deep ache of a bruise reaching full development. I'll figure it out. When? He looked at her. You've been here 18 hours. 14 of which were very instructive. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. His face wasn't doing full smiles yet, hadn't been for a while, but something adjacent to it. Something that had been gone long enough that it felt unfamiliar in his facial muscles. You should rest, he said. The wound needs another day before you travel anywhere. I know. She turned back toward the door. So do you. She stayed 4 days. Not because she needed 4 days medically. The wound was clean, the sutures held. She was moving without significant pain by the 3rd morning. She stayed because the federal process required availability, because Ellery's situation needed to be managed remotely through a series of calls that she made from the kitchen table with the satellite phone, and because Wyoming in January with no vehicle and no functional outside contact was not a situation that resolved itself quickly. Daniel didn't mind. He would have said he minded before. He had built this place specifically to not have people in it, but the cabin felt different with a second person in it. Not invaded exactly, more like a building that had forgotten what it was designed for and was being reminded. The kitchen smelled like coffee in the mornings. Ranger split his attention between them. In the evenings, Celeste read from the military history books on Daniel's shelf and occasionally made remarks about the strategic decisions being described that were incisive enough to make him put down whatever he was doing and look at her. On the second day, Marcus came. He drove up in the Chevy pickup with Sarah in the passenger seat and Owen in the back, and he stood in the driveway for a moment just looking at the ranch, the tire tracks, the damaged fence gate, the evidence markers the federal team had left and not yet collected. And then he looked at Daniel standing on the porch. Marcus was not a man who cried. He was a slow, deliberate, physically contained person who communicated mostly through the degree to which he was or wasn't making eye contact. He walked up to the porch steps, stopped, and looked at Daniel for several seconds with an expression that covered a lot of ground. Then he said, "You look terrible." "I've had a few days." "Owen told me what happened." A pause. "Most of it." "Most is probably enough." Marcus put his hand on Daniel's shoulder, the left one, fortunately, not the grazed right, and gripped it for a moment. It was the kind of grip that said things that neither of them were going to say out loud because they'd both grown up in a house where things got communicated sideways rather than directly, and that hadn't changed just because they were adults with better vocabularies. "Sarah's angry," Marcus said. "I know. She'll get over it." "I know that too." Marcus released his shoulder and looked past him into the cabin, where Celeste was visible at the kitchen table with the satellite phone. "Is she all right?" "She's getting there." "What happens to her now?" Daniel thought about it. "She goes back, manages the estate, deals with the legal process, rebuilds what she can." He paused. "She's going to be fine. She's better at the world than she looks." "What about you?" He looked at his brother. "What do you mean?" "I mean, you've been out here alone for 3 years and something happened and now you look—" Marcus searched for the word. "Like you came back from somewhere." Daniel said nothing for a moment. "I don't know yet," he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said to his brother in a long time. Celeste left on the 5th day. A car from Rice's office came to collect her. She had to be in Denver for a formal evidentiary proceeding related to the court filing her father had made. And after that, there was an emergency board meeting at Vaughn Industrial's headquarters that she'd been advised to attend in person to prevent the management vacuum from becoming structural. She packed what little she had, mostly things Daniel had found for her: a spare flannel, a pair of wool socks, a hat that had been hanging on the back of the mudroom door for 2 years. And she stood in the driveway beside the federal vehicle and looked at the ranch the way someone looked at a place they were making a memory of. Daniel stood on the porch. Ranger sat beside him. "I'll send you a proper coat," she said, "to replace the one that got ruined." "You don't have to do that." "I know." She looked at him. "I'm going to do it anyway." He came down the porch steps, stopped at the bottom. "You know where to reach me." "Satellite phone that you apparently almost never use." "I'll use it more." She tilted her head slightly. "Will you actually?" "Probably not." Something crossed her face that might have been exasperation, or might have been something else that she'd decided to file under exasperation for practical reasons. "Daniel." She said it the way people said a name when they wanted to make sure you were actually listening. "What happened here? You didn't have to do any of it. You could have called someone and driven away." "No, I couldn't." "I know." She held his gaze. "That's what I'm saying." He stood at the bottom of the porch steps and watched the car go up the ranch road and turn onto the county road and disappear. And then he stood there for another minute because there was nothing that needed doing immediately, and he was allowing himself, for once, the experience of standing still without it meaning failure. Ranger pressed against his leg. 6 months passed. Helena Vaughn was formally indicted on 4 counts, the most significant being first-degree murder in the death of Warren Vaughn, with a prosecutorial timeline that Race had characterized as thorough rather than fast, which turned out to mean it would take 2 years to reach trial and another 4 months beyond that for the jury to deliberate on 11 days of toxicology testimony, financial records, and the recording Warren Vaughn had made 4 weeks before his death in a home office in Denver, with the door locked and his phone running a recording app that he downloaded at 2 in the morning. The jury was out for 11 days. They came back with guilty on all 4 counts. Raymond Gault, whose connection to the contracted personnel had been documented in Helena's communications network, pled to a single conspiracy charge 18 months into the process in exchange for testimony that helped close 3 subsidiary cases involving the bribery of 2 state officials and a former law enforcement administrator. He lost his position, his assets, and most of what had made him useful to anyone. His attorney filed 6 appeals over 4 years. None of them went anywhere. Martin Ellery, Celeste's father's attorney, cooperated fully with federal prosecutors from the first week of the investigation. The information he'd provided to Helena under what he described as coercive pressure was weighed against his complete subsequent cooperation and his 30-year record, and the U.S. Attorney's Office elected not to prosecute. He retired from practice the following spring and sent Celeste a letter that she read twice and then folded and put in a drawer in her Denver office and didn't speak about to anyone except, eventually, Daniel. The ranch changed. It started small, the way things that change everything tend to start. A phone call from Garrett, 8 months after the incident. Not about work, just checking in, the first time Garrett had done that in 3 years. A conversation with Marcus that lasted longer than their usual 20 minutes, and covered ground they hadn't covered since before Daniel had left for Virginia Beach, a decade before. Owen, who had started showing up on weekends to help with fence work, and who never once asked for a detailed account of what had happened in January, but who was clearly processing something about what he'd seen and was doing it by being present and useful, which was, Daniel recognized, the same method he'd used at 17. The call from Celeste came in October. Not a satellite phone call. She'd finally gotten him to use an actual cell phone, a process that had required 3 separate conversations and one occasion where she'd simply mailed him a phone with a note that said, "I need to be able to reach you, and so does Rice. Figure it out." She called on a Tuesday in October and started without preamble. "I want to do something with the estate," she said, "with part of it. There's a section of the portfolio that my father always said was underperforming and that the board has been trying to liquidate, but the real problem is nobody knows what to do with it, and the numbers make it look less useful than it is." "Okay. I want to build something." She paused, and he could hear the slight difference in her voice that meant she'd thought about this enough that she was choosing words carefully. "There are a lot of veterans in this state who come back and don't have anything to come back to. No structure, no purpose, no—" She paused again. "No ranger." I was quiet. "I've been researching military working dog retirement programs," she said, "and veteran support programs that have actually shown results. The ones that work aren't the ones that give people money. They're the ones that give people something to do that matters." She stopped. "I want to pair them. Dogs that need homes with veterans who need something to take care of. I want to build a facility that does the matching and the training and provides follow-up support." Another pause. "I want it in Wyoming." He looked out the window at the pasture. The October light was doing something specific to the dry grass that turned it the color of old copper, and Ranger was in the middle of it, moving in a slow patrol pattern that had been covering the same ground for 2 years. "That's a real thing," Daniel said. "I know it is. I have numbers. I have a model. I have 4 nonprofit attorneys and a board structure and a federal grant application that's 90% complete." A beat. "What I don't have is someone who understands both sides of it well enough to run the operational component." "Celeste, you've been fixing fences for 3 years. I like fixing fences." "I know you do." Her voice was steady, not pushing, giving him space to find his own way to the answer, which was, he was starting to understand how she operated when she actually wanted something. "But you're better at other things, and there are people who need those things, and the fences are going to be there regardless." He stood at the window for a long time. Outside, Ranger completed his circuit of the pasture and stopped at the north fence line, looking into the tree line. The same spot. Always the same spot. "Tell me the numbers," Daniel said. He could hear the shift in her voice when she understood what he was saying. Not excitement exactly. Celeste didn't do uncontrolled excitement. but something that was relief and satisfaction compressed into a single breath. I'll send them tonight. The Ranger Initiative opened 18 months later on 40 acres that Celeste had identified and purchased in a valley south of Sheridan, close enough to a small city to be accessible, far enough from everything else to be what it needed to be. The facility had 8 training kennels, residential space for 12 veterans in the transitional program, a veterinary clinic that was staffed 3 days a week by a retired military vet who drove in from Gillette, and a main building that the architect had designed to look like it had always been there, which in Wyoming meant low and horizontal, and built from materials that didn't argue with the landscape. Daniel ran the operational side. He hadn't known, before he started, how much of what he'd developed in 12 years of special operations translated to building a program from the ground up. The planning discipline, the logistical thinking, the ability to assess people fast and accurately and put them where they'd be most effective. He'd thought of those skills as combat skills. Turned out they were just skills. He was not by nature a public-facing person. The first time a local news crew came to do a feature on the program, he stood in the background and answered questions in as few words as possible, and was deeply relieved when it was over. Celeste, who had come from Denver for the opening and stayed through the news cycle, watched this from across the room with an expression of what he could only describe as deeply unsurprised amusement. "You were interviewed twice," she said afterward. "That's twice too many. You used full sentences. I was impressed. I'm going to check on the kennels." "You checked on the kennels 20 minutes ago." He went and checked on the kennels. In the second year, a veteran named Torres came through the program. He'd been in the Army for 11 years, 2 tours of Iraq, and had separated after an IED blast that had taken 2 members of his unit and left him with a TBI that had resolved mostly but not entirely, and a relationship with sleep that was, as he described it to Daniel in a flat, tired voice during intake, basically adversarial. He was matched with a German shepherd named Kala, a 4-year-old retired patrol dog from a California sheriff's department who had developed anxiety responses to loud sounds that made her unsuitable for continued law enforcement work. She had good bones and a good temperament, and she was scared of exactly the kinds of things Torres was scared of, which seemed counterproductive on paper and turned out to be the opposite in practice. By month 3, Torres was sleeping 6 hours a night, which he reported as if he'd won something significant, and he had, because for the previous 2 years he'd been sleeping 3. He stayed through the full 6-month program. On his last day, he stood in the main building with Kala sitting on his foot, which was where she'd developed a habit of sitting, and he looked at Daniel and said, "I didn't think this was going to be real." "Real how?" "Like, actually do anything. I've done programs, I've done groups." He looked down at Kala. "This is different." Daniel didn't say anything for a moment. He'd learned, in the 2 years of running the program, that the moments after statements like that one were better left empty than filled. "You going to be okay?" he asked. Torres looked up. Something behind his eyes that had been closed when he arrived was open. Not fixed. Daniel was careful about the word fixed, had learned to be careful about it, but open. "Yeah," Torres said. "I think I actually am. But Ranger died on a morning in early November. 4 years after the night everything had changed. He died the way Daniel had hoped he would die. Not a dramatic decline, not a long illness that required hard decisions, but a morning where he didn't get up when Daniel came into the kitchen, and when Daniel knelt beside him on the floor, Ranger put his head into Daniel's hand and his tail moved once, and then he was still. Daniel sat on this kitchen floor for a long time. He called Celeste. She answered in 2 rings. "Ranger's gone," he said. A silence on her end, long enough to mean something. "I'm sorry," she said. "Daniel, I'm really sorry." He didn't say anything. "Do you want me to come up?" He looked at the dog, at the gray on his muzzle that had spread over the past year, at the old scar on his left rear leg from the IED in Afghanistan, at the completely specific and unrepeatable way he had positioned himself in his sleep for 7 years. "No," Daniel said. "I'm okay." "You don't have to be." "I know." He closed his eyes briefly. "I know." He buried Ranger in the north pasture, at the tree line, near the fence. He didn't mark it with anything elaborate. A flat stone from the creek bed, squared up and set level, which took him longer than it should have because he kept stopping. He stood at the grave in the November cold and didn't say anything because there was nothing adequate to say. Well, 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, he heard the dog before he saw it. Not barking, not Ranger's bark, which he would have recognized anywhere and which he was still, in unguarded moments, listening for. Just a sound at the fence line, a whine, then silence, then the whine again. He went out with his coffee. At the north fence, in almost exactly the same place where he'd found Celeste 4 years earlier, a young German shepherd sat in the snow. Thin, matted, one ear slightly torn, looking at Daniel with the particular expression of an animal who has been through something and is trying to determine whether the person in front of it is the end of that something or the continuation of it. No tags, no collar, no indication of where it had come from or how long it had been moving. Daniel stood at the fence for a moment. The dog looked at him. He opened the gate. The dog walked through and sat at his feet and looked up at him, and Daniel crouched down and put his hand on the animal's neck and felt the weight of it. The solidity of a living thing that had found its way to exactly the right fence at exactly the right time, which was either coincidence or the universe operating in the only language it consistently spoke. He brought the dog inside, called Celeste that afternoon. "I have a dog." A pause. Then, "Tell me about the dog." "Young, shepherd. Found her at the north fence this morning. She's going to need a few weeks before she's ready for the program." "She?" "Yeah. What are you going to call her?" He looked at the dog, who had fallen asleep on the kitchen floor. In the spot that had been Ranger's spot for 7 years and had taken it over with the unself-conscious certainty of an animal who understood that a place meant for sleeping was meant for sleeping. "Hope," he said. Celeste was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was different, softer at the edges. "That's a good name." "I thought so." Outside, the Wyoming winter was doing what Wyoming winter did, pressing down on everything, filling in the spaces between things with white silence, making the world smaller and the distances greater and the light, when it came through, more particular and more worth paying attention to. The mountains held their positions on the horizon. The ranch sat in its valley. The fence line ran straight and true along the north edge of the property. Life did not fix itself. It accumulated. Loss laid over loss, choice laid over choice, the weight of people who were gone resting on the same foundation as the weight of people who remained. The nightmares didn't disappear. The shoulder ached in cold weather. There were mornings when getting up required something he didn't always feel he had. But he got up. Every morning. He got up and made coffee, and walked the property, and did the work that was in front of him, and the work had started meaning something again, which was the most honest thing he knew about recovery. It didn't announce itself. It just accumulated, day over day, until one morning you realized you were on the other side of something and couldn't quite point to when the crossing had happened. Hope lifted her head from the floor and looked at him. He refilled his coffee. It wasn't a perfect life. It wasn't a healed life or a finished one, or one that had resolved into the kind of clean simplicity that people sometimes imagined waited on the other side of hard things. It was just a life, and it was finally his. The strongest thing a person can do is not endure alone. It is choose, in the hardest moment, to reach back for someone else.